USP Leavenworth, the psychological impact of military prison. USP Leavenworth was never meant to feel like a normal prison, because it wasn't built for normal prisoners. Behind its fortress-style walls, men trained for war were once punished under a system where discipline was absolute, obedience was survival, and the mind was the first battlefield. For decades, this was the only federal prison where soldiers and civilians lived under the same roofs, yet followed two completely different psychological codes. Some inmates arrived with rigid military conditioning, marching, saluting, responding to orders as if still on deployment. Others were civilians who'd never worn a uniform, suddenly trapped beside men shaped by combat, command, and hierarchy. And inside Leavenworth, those worlds didn't just collide. They reshaped everything about how punishment worked, how authority was enforced, and how inmates mentally survived. This is the untold truth of USP Leavenworth, the psychological impact of military prison. A story of discipline, identity, and the invisible rules that controlled America's oldest federal penitentiary. This documentary contains descriptions of prison conditions and violence for educational purposes based on verified sources. Viewer discretion is advised. For more deep research of prison documentary like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. When the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth opened in 1895, it was more than the first federal prison. It became a psychological laboratory. Built beside a massive Army installation and operating in cooperation with the U.S. military, Leavenworth held soldiers who violated military law long before a separate military justice system fully existed. The result was unprecedented. A single prison where federal inmates and military offenders shared the same space, but lived in fundamentally different mental worlds. Civilians entered Leavenworth fearing punishment. Soldiers entered Leavenworth fearing failure. That difference changed everything, from how they reacted to authority, to how they formed alliances, to how they broke under pressure or adapted to survive. As we move through this documentary, we'll uncover how military discipline reshaped daily life inside a federal penitentiary, why military and civilian inmates responded to punishment in radically different ways, how Leavenworth influenced the creation of America's modern military prison system, and what remains today of that unique psychological legacy. To understand Leavenworth is to understand a system where minds were trained to obey, and incarceration tested whether that training could protect or destroy the men who lived behind the walls. Inside USP Leavenworth. USP Leavenworth has always carried a presence that hits inmates long before the cell door closes. Its massive stone structure, modeled after old European fortresses, projects something deeper than punishment. It signals order, authority, and an expectation of discipline that dates back to the 19th century. From the earliest days, the staff who ran the prison understood exactly what made Leavenworth different. Many of the men entering those gates already had a psychological blueprint for structure. They came from the Army, sometimes the Navy or Marine Corps, trained to follow commands, adapt to hardship, and suppress emotion. But Leavenworth mixed those men with civilians from every corner of the federal system. The result was a silent but powerful divide that shaped daily survival. The military mindset behind bars. Military-trained inmates approached imprisonment with a kind of internal rigidity. They woke early, kept their space ordered, stood straighter when officers passed, and reacted strongly to anything that resembled a chain of command. Even decades later, officers reported that former soldiers adjusted faster to routine, responded more sharply to discipline, and carried a sense of hierarchy into inmate interactions. But that same conditioning could crack under the stresses of confinement. A soldier's identity was built around service, rank, duty, and losing that identity inside a prison cell created a psychological conflict that civilian inmates didn't experience. Some military inmates clung to structure to survive. Others spiraled when the uniform came off and the chain of command disappeared. Two populations, one prison. Civilians in Leavenworth noticed the difference instantly. Some respected the former soldiers. Some feared them. Others resented the way military inmates moved with an unspoken set of rules and loyalties. And this blend, rigid discipline beside raw desperation, became one of the most unique social experiments in American incarceration. USP Leavenworth wasn't just a prison. For decades, it was a psychological crossroads where military culture and civilian punishment collided in ways no other penitentiary in the country experienced. America's first federal prison. When USP Leavenworth opened in 1895, it became the foundation upon which the entire federal prison system was built. Before this institution existed, federal offenders were scattered across state prisons, military posts, and makeshift facilities with no unified philosophy of punishment. Leavenworth changed that. It wasn't just the first federal penitentiary, it was the testing ground for what federal incarceration would become. Every rule, every housing model, every approach to discipline had to be built from scratch. And because of its location beside one of the largest army installations in the country, its earliest years were shaped by a powerful military influence. A prison designed with military precision. Leavenworth's original structure reflected the mindset of the era. Symmetry, strict organization, and a layout meant to enforce psychological control. Early wardens borrowed concepts directly from military discipline. Rigid daily schedules. Formal counts resembling troop formations. Strict expectations for cleanliness and order. Emphasis on routine as a tool of behavior. This atmosphere wasn't accidental. Many early staff members had military backgrounds themselves, shaping a culture where authority wasn't just exercised, it was displayed. For inmates from the armed forces, this environment felt familiar, even if it was painful. For civilians, it introduced a level of discipline they had never encountered. The beginning of a dual system. Long before the U.S. military built its own separate disciplinary barracks, Leavenworth became the default holding place for soldiers who violated federal or military law. That meant early administrators had to manage two worlds at once. The Federal Criminal Code. The Military Code of Justice. This duality forced the prison to innovate. It developed procedures that blended civilian corrections with the expectations of military command, procedures that later shaped both federal policy and the military justice system itself. A historic responsibility. By the early 20th century, Leavenworth wasn't just a prison. It was the authority on incarceration. Officials from other states toured it. Policymakers modeled new penitentiaries after it. The Department of Justice used its operations to standardize future federal facilities. But even as it became a symbol of national order, the internal culture remained deeply shaped by the coexistence of two psychological worlds, military and civilian, living behind the same walls. Leavenworth didn't just make history. It created the framework for how America punishes, disciplines, and attempts to rehabilitate. Military versus civilian psychology. No other federal prison in America exposed the psychological gap between two types of inmates the way Leavenworth did. When military offenders were placed alongside civilians, the differences weren't subtle, they were foundational. They didn't just respond differently to punishment. They lived differently. They thought differently. They broke differently. Military conditioning. Obedience as identity. For military inmates, discipline wasn't a rule they followed. It was a core part of who they were. Years of training had conditioned them to regulate emotion, accept hierarchy, respond to authority, preserve unit loyalty. Even after incarceration stripped away their rank, that conditioning didn't disappear. It shaped everything from how they handled conflict to how they processed shame. Many soldiers entered Leavenworth believing that misconduct wasn't just a crime, but a betrayal of their entire identity. That internal conflict created a psychological weight few civilian inmates understood. Civilian mindset, resistance over structure. Civilian inmates often viewed authority as something to push against. Their survival strategies were more individualistic, and they relied heavily on alliances formed inside prison rather than a pre-existing sense of duty or hierarchy. Civilian psychology inside Leavenworth leaned toward questioning authority, resisting rigid routines, forming loyalty based on self-preservation, defining identity through independence rather than rank. Where military inmates defaulted to structure, civilians defaulted to adaptability. Clashes, respect, and silent rules. This difference created an unusual dynamic. Some civilians admired the discipline of former soldiers, seeing them as steady and predictable. Others viewed them with suspicion, unsure how to interpret their rigidity or their loyalty to one another. Meanwhile, many military inmates were troubled by the lack of structure among civilians. The unpredictable behaviors, emotional volatility, and refusal to follow routine often conflicted with their own worldview. These differences did not always erupt into open conflict, but they created a layered social map inside Leavenworth. Military inmates tended to cluster. Civilian inmates formed looser groups. Respect flowed in unexpected directions. The prison's environment became a psychological ecosystem shaped by two cultures that rarely mixed in the outside world. The stress of identity loss. For some soldiers, the most painful part of incarceration wasn't confinement, it was the erosion of their identity. A civilian inmate might enter prison feeling anger, fear, or defiance. A military inmate often entered feeling something more complicated: disgrace. They weren't just losing freedom. They were losing the uniform, the mission, and the purpose that once anchored their sense of self. That psychological fracture became one of the defining elements of Leavenworth's history, setting it apart from every other prison in the country. Famous military inmates. Across its long history, USP Leavenworth housed a number of military offenders whose cases revealed how differently the justice system handled soldiers, and how differently those soldiers experienced incarceration. The stories of these men were closely examined by federal agencies, military historians, and the Department of Defense. While the details varied, their psychological journeys shared a powerful theme. They arrived at Leavenworth carrying both the weight of punishment and the weight of losing a life defined by service. Soldiers whose cases shaped public debate. Some military inmates sent to Leavenworth were involved in offenses that became national conversations about military conduct and federal responsibility. Their cases were not defined by extreme violence or sensationalism, but by the complexity of military duty, personal decisions under pressure, and the difficult boundary between civilian law and military discipline. These inmates entered prison under extraordinary public scrutiny. For many, the psychological impact of their incarceration came not from the sentence itself, but from the collapse of their reputation within the institution they once served. A soldier might have once worn medals. Inside Leavenworth, those symbols meant nothing. What remained was the internal conflict between who they were trained to be and the choices that brought them to a cell. The psychological weight of public expectations. Military inmates often described a unique pressure. The feeling that they weren't just being punished for an offense, but for failing a standard they once lived by. Some arrived with decades of honorable service behind them. Others were young, early in their careers, still shaped by drill instructors and unit cohesion. Once imprisoned, many struggled with the loss of identity tied to rank, the guilt of letting down their unit or command, the abrupt shift from structure to confinement, the fear of how their military community would remember them. Civilian inmates rarely carried this same emotional burden. For soldiers, incarceration often meant navigating punishment and personal shame at the same time. A system that learned from its own history. The presence of these well-known military inmates played an unexpected role in shaping federal and military policy. Their cases exposed gaps in the justice system, raised questions about how soldiers should be housed, and ultimately influenced the development of dedicated military correctional facilities. By studying their experiences, documented by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and military investigators, officials began to understand that the psychological needs of military offenders were fundamentally different. Leavenworth was never designed to be a military prison. But for decades, it served as the place where the military learned what a modern military incarceration system would need to become. The disciplinary barracks. Long before America fully understood the psychological differences between military and civilian offenders, Leavenworth became the proving ground that forced the government to confront them. The result was the creation of a separate military prison system, centered around a facility that would become almost as famous as Leavenworth itself. The United States Disciplinary Barracks, often simply called the DB. born beside a federal fortress. The DB was established on the grounds of Fort Leavenworth, just a short distance from the Federal Penitentiary. The Army built it after realizing that military prisoners required something different, an environment that blended discipline, rehabilitation, and accountability within a structure familiar to the armed forces. While USP Leavenworth held federal inmates under the authority of the Department of Justice, the DB operated under military command. This separation allowed the military to enforce its own disciplinary standards, its own housing procedures, and its own expectations for behavior. Even the psychological atmosphere was different. Soldiers in the DB encountered routines built to resemble service life, structured schedules, training-like activities, and a hierarchy that remained intact even behind bars. A controlled environment with a purpose. The DB's approach was shaped by the belief that soldiers needed order to maintain stability. Where USP Leavenworth focused on broad federal standards, the DB focused on military identity. Uniforms replaced street clothes. Ranks were removed but discipline remained. Routines were strict but purposeful. Communication followed formal rules. For many soldiers, this environment created a sense of familiarity that eased the psychological shock of incarceration. For others, it intensified the emotional conflict between their past service and their current circumstances. But one thing became clear. Military offenders responded differently when the structure around them aligned with the structure inside them. Leavenworth's lasting influence. The creation of the DB did not remove all military inmates from the federal system, but it dramatically reshaped how the military handled justice. Leavenworth had demonstrated that mixing two psychological worlds, military and civilian, created complications for both populations. The experience of soldiers housed at USP Leavenworth helped guide the development of military-specific rehabilitation programs, command-based authority structures in confinement, specialized training for guards and staff, and long-term policies differentiating military corrections from federal corrections. In many ways, the military prison at Fort Leavenworth exists because the federal prison beside it exposed the limits of a one-size-fits-all system. USP Leavenworth didn't just witness the birth of the disciplinary barracks. It forced it into existence. Modern-day Leavenworth. Today, USP Leavenworth is no longer the towering symbol of federal power it once was. The old fortress, famous for its massive stone walls and castle-like design, now operates as a medium-security facility. But its psychological legacy, shaped by decades of housing both civilian and military offenders, still influences how the prison functions. Even though military inmates are now primarily housed in the separate U.S. disciplinary barracks, the imprint of those earlier years remains woven into Leavenworth's culture, policies, and identity. A shift in purpose, not in presence. Modern Leavenworth continues to serve the Federal Bureau of Prisons, holding civilian federal inmates under structured programs and standardized correctional practices. But unlike many contemporary federal prisons, Leavenworth's layout and routines still reflect the principles that guided its creation. Ordered housing units, strict schedules, emphasis on rules and compliance, the culture of structured authority. These elements, born from a combination of early federal practices and military influence, created a facility where discipline was embedded into the architecture. Even after its role changed, that environment remained. Staff and training built on a historic foundation. Leavenworth's staff today benefit from more than a century of institutional knowledge. The Federal Bureau of Prisons continues to use lessons learned from the facility's past to guide officer training, emphasizing communication, consistency, and psychological awareness. Officers learn to recognize how different inmate backgrounds shape behavior. This understanding traces directly back to the decades when soldiers and civilians lived side by side, revealing how structure affects stability and how identity affects adaptation. Leavenworth became a case study in the human mind under constraint, knowledge still applied in modern correctional strategies across the federal system. A prison that shaped a nation's understanding of incarceration. While Leavenworth no longer houses soldiers, its history remains vital to the institutions that do. The Department of Defense continues to study its past as part of understanding The roots of military corrections. The psychological needs of service members in confinement. The consequences of mixing distinct inmate populations. And the importance of specialized environments for military offenders. Modern military prisons, including the disciplinary barracks, were built with these lessons in mind. Leavenworth's influence reaches far beyond Kansas. It helped define how the United States approaches incarceration, military and civilian, for more than a century. A legacy of discipline and identity. Today, the fortress no longer stands as the home of a dual justice system. Yet its story remains one of the most unique in American prison history. A place where discipline was culture, identity was conflict, and punishment revealed the complex psychology of those trained for war. USP Leavenworth may have evolved, but its lessons remain powerful, shaping the systems that came after, and reminding us how deeply discipline and identity affect the human mind behind bars. The legacy of a prison that shaped two worlds. USP Leavenworth stands today as a reminder that punishment is never just physical, it is psychological. Its history reveals something deeper than concrete walls or razor wire. The impact of identity, discipline, and culture on the human mind. For decades, soldiers and civilians shared this space, but they lived different realities. Civilians arrived with individual survival strategies. Soldiers arrived with the weight of service, duty, and a code that had shaped their entire lives. From that conflict came lessons that reshaped the nation's understanding of incarceration. Leavenworth forced policymakers, military leaders, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons to confront a simple truth. You cannot punish two different minds the same way. And because of that realization, America built a separate system, one that acknowledged the unique psychology of military offenders and the importance of structure in rehabilitation. Leavenworth's influence is still felt today in every military correctional facility, every federal training program, and every discussion about how identity shapes behavior behind bars. The fortress may no longer house soldiers, but its impact lives on. It remains one of the most important institutions in understanding how a nation disciplines its warriors, and how those warriors confront punishment when the battlefield disappears and the walls close in. If you found this documentary insightful and want more deep dives into the psychology of federal and military incarceration, make sure you subscribe, because we're just getting started.